Tim,
Yeah.
could I add a poem? There's another approach to this. I think, I don't know if Alden Nolan really planned to write a poem about virtue or
No.
not. I think he was fascinated by the perplexity and the complexity emotionally of that situation.
Yeah.
Virtue was something that really did come up a lot in his poems, though.
Yes.
But I actually, probably Tim too, have set out sometimes to write poems that somehow embody or exemplify a virtue without necessarily talking about it abstractly. And this is one of mine. It's called Reverence. It connects directly to the book that Tim is relating, Woodruff's Reverence. Isn't that the one that got you started really thinking about this? So I read that book too on Tim's recommendation, and I wanted to write a poem about reverence. And so this is what I came up with. And it has a dream in it. I'm back in my hometown, walking up Bridge Street past the St. Regis paper mill, where my grandpa Smith punched the clock until he retired. It's been too long since I've visited my grandparents. Weeks, even months. I think of them in their small house across the alley from the park, in pine and cedar shade where those two old people live in the gathering silence of the end. My grandmother with her social hunger, my grandfather with his Milwaukee journal and cigar. What if they were to think I don't love them? The pain hits like an axe blow. I resolve to go knock on their door immediately. Some weight swings to, rebalances heaven and earth. I can't tell whether I'm awake or still asleep when I realize they've been dead for decades. Dear grandmother and grandfather, forgive my complaining. When your son, my father, sent me over to mow your lawn, rake your leaves, shovel your sidewalk, I couldn't imagine all three of you gone. I am better for living, though not in time, to give you the reverence which was your due, and which I kept hidden from myself in my heart.
I could hear the gasps.
So I guess I did use the word reverence in it, but it was really an attempt to give the feeling of what. It always seems to involve some kind of turn, doesn't it?
Yes.
A choice. You know, you can either forget and be thoughtless, or you can go on in the other direction.
There's a choice with virtue. And if a person doesn't have virtue, we can't give it to them. If there's a little bit of virtue in a person, for instance, if you have a little bit of reverence, this poem suddenly resonates with your sense of reverence, and you hear the gasp. If you have courage, you recognize courage someplace else. However, you can't tell by a person's face if they have courage. You can't even tell if that person has reverence. A good artist can illustrate emotion in a face. A good artist, a good painter, cannot illustrate a virtue in a person's face, because a virtue is only recognized when it's in relationship with someone or something else. So the image of something that is virtuous, it's a virtuous act. It is a relationship, courage, reverence, respect, wisdom, compassion. Any virtue, any label. And we all know what a virtue is. We struggle with the labels. but we can only recognize it when it is activated.
Here's where the artist's intention comes in. I really wanted people to look at that poem through the lens of the element of reverence and the part that it played.
Yes.
Because reverence was the determining factor whether I would go and see my grandparents in the dream and let them know that I loved them and revered them, which was something that when I was a teenager was very far from my conscious attention and intention. So I really wanted it to be seen through that lens.
Again, I mean, if I don't have the capacity for reverence, I wouldn't see it in a poem. I guess that's the point.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And a virtue is a capacity. In fact, this is Woodruff's definition of a virtue. A virtue is the capacity to have certain feelings and emotions when this capacity has been cultivated through training and experience in such a way that it inclines those who have it toward doing the right thing. For myself, here's my explanation. A virtue is the capacity to make a choice that reconnects one to the greater good. Or this morning, Francis used to the greater context or to the whole. So when we make a choice that reconnects us to the greater good, that greater good could simply be diving off the diving board, the courage that a small child has to dive off the diving board. That choice is, this is going to make me more alive. This is going to make me more adventurous. And it took an enormous amount of courage to do that. That's another thing about courage. We cannot compare types of courage. They're incomparable because they're immeasurable. Courage is courage. When Malala stood up to the Taliban in Pakistan, I salute her courage. I salute that over and over and over again. But there are so many other people who are also courageous that don't get the celebrity. She may be the role model for many women to come, and God, I hope so. But do we measure what Malala did to the 12-year-old who stands up to her stepfather and finally says, "Fuck you, you're not touching me again, asshole"? Mm-hmm. Whose courage is more? We can't measure that. The virtues are immeasurable. And the virtues are there in the face of emotion, in the midst of emotion. It's the choice they make.
I'll just throw a little wild card in here quick. I'm a little bit hesitant to ascribe courage or virtues only to human beings in the human world.
Yeah.
I don't know how far it goes, but this is how far the French poet and philosopher Francis Ponge went with it. He said that things, that chair, this microphone, this notebook, he said that things were heroes for just being discrete objects with their own functions, their own integrity, and their own continuing retention of their forms. So, he's very existential, but it's an interesting way to look at the world, I mean, there's a lot of courage in the walls, maybe.
I don't see the
Oh, who knows?
the choice to dissolve or not.
I don't know. You'd have to ask the chair.
Yeah. And the chair has a different language than we do.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. The shamans might understand it though. Yeah.
There's a temple in China that is named "This Mountain Dares to Exist."
Yep.
This mountain dares to exist. That's great.
Now, all of us men are in this room because someplace inside of us, we have virtue. We wouldn't be here if we didn't have virtue of some sort, whether it's courage, wisdom, compassion, whatever label you want to put on your personal virtues, that's fine. And we don't acknowledge virtue often. We don't acknowledge courage, and that's the role that we have to play as elders. We have to acknowledge the virtues in the younger people because they're not readily visible to the world. And we recognize virtue when it is an activity between two people. We can recognize it and we have to point it out so that our young people say, oh, there is that good in me. I just made a good choice. That's how we worked with the young men in Red Wing. Whenever they made a good choice, we had to point it out because they were never told that they do make good choices, that they do have virtues inside them. And sometimes you have to remind them over and over and over again, that was a good choice you made. That was a nice thing that you did when you went over and you put your arm around that other guy who was crying.